Hi, welcome to episode 8 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in these last few years, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, and today I'm super excited to be joined by a longtime friend, Kyle Pasewark. Kyle and I were junior associates at the law firm of Debevoise Plimpton back in the early and mid aughts, which seems like a really long time ago. Um, and the junior associate experience in New York, at least with Debevoise, but I'm sure a lot of them I think you feel like you're in the trenches, and everybody I think you work with makes I think a very favorable impression upon you. And at Debevoise, there's certainly a lot of great people, but even amongst them, Kyle I think stood out even further. And I think in particular because he was the first person I think I'd ever met from Wyoming. So I thought, since Kyle has since moved back to Wyoming, that it would be it would be a lot of fun and really insightful to check in with him and see how he's doing, and talk about life in a very different part of the country. Kyle, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I am doing fine, and thanks so much for having me, Michael. This is a nice reunion in a way.
Yeah.
Until, of course, you come out here.
That would be great. Before we got on, we were talking a bit, and you had just come in from talking to your neighbor, and I was wondering if you could go back to what you and your neighbor were talking about.
Well, we were talking about the one thing about living in a rural area is you don't see people very much, and this is a neighbor from 4 miles away. But he was driving up along our road, and one of the things we were talking about was relocating or finding again, not relocating because they relocate themselves, the elk herds that come down from the mountains during the winter and graze here and come on our land at night a lot. You could go out in the morning and you can see your land has been fertilized profusely by the elk wandering down from where they are to the river. And I thought they'd gone back up to the mountains because it's been warmer, but he said no, they're still going to the canyon just west of us. So we chatted about the elk. We chatted about land development in the community we're in. When you meet people, you don't see them very often, but when you do, the conversations tend to go on.
Well, I have a lot of things to ask, just like from that alone. But like, how big is a herd of elk? Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, we have wintering here. We have two herds of about 200 apiece.
Wow.
That are usually about 4 or 5 miles north of us, but come across our land and other people's land on occasion. Generally at night, although sometimes they'll come during the day. And about a year and a half ago, there was a herd of about 80 rejoining the bigger herd that came across right at sunrise. It was just astonishing. We're within about 50 feet of the house, and then just kind of moseyed on up to where they graze most of the day.
Wow. Is it dangerous?
Well, you don't want to get too close to them, but they're not. Because you just don't want to panic them. We were in Yellowstone National Park a couple of years back, and there was a family with kids that were coming like within 10, 15 feet of the elk. And it was just like, what are you doing? These are actually wild animals. Now they're, as far as I can tell, they're very nice animals, but you don't want to panic them. And so, yeah, you don't want to get too close because they're real big.
Wow. And are there, it's a big difference from, I guess encountering squirrels and pigeons in Manhattan.
Yes, it is. The elk do not drop stuff on your head.
Although I suspect what they do drop is a lot more substantial.
Yeah, it's because the soil out here is so dry. You're happy for any fertilizer you can get, and you can always see the elk. And we also get a fair number of antelope wandering around, and those are just they're just gorgeous creatures. and so they'll come out every now and again. But yeah, you kind of have to watch where you walk, or at least wipe your feet before you come in the house.
um, and then so you're talking about like, your neighbor. I guess in New York City, as you know, like I think you see so many people that you just end up like you couldn't talk to everybody that crossed your path. Like even like your neighbors in your building, it's like, oh, I'll see you tomorrow, and I'm rushing from here to there. I mean, do you have to completely rewire your brain for, I guess, where you're setting now? I mean, it seems like a survival thing. Of course, you'd want to talk to any human beings that you come across, but is that natural or
Yeah, I mean, and although I'm from a different part of the state, and I'm from what was the third largest, and still the third largest town in Wyoming. When I grew up, it was about 17,000. Now it's about 30,000. But that's right. I mean, it's when you see people, if they stop or if you stop, you do kind of feel the obligation to talk to them. And since you don't see them every day, you tend to talk for a long time. And a lot of people are here in kind of the, Wyoming way, because they want to be mostly left alone. So, you don't see them that often, but when you do, you want to chat with them.
and I imagine like if you chose not to, like if that neighbor that was driving by you just kind of like looked at and kept moving and didn't show an inclination to talk to them, would that be considered rude, or would they just be like, he's too busy, which may
Well,
be rude in and of
you
itself?
want to at least give, you want to at least give, at least in this community, the wave to
Okay.
acknowledge to acknowledge their presence. But
Mhm.
yeah, people don't stop all the time, and I
Mhm.
don't think that's, nobody thinks that's rude.
Mhm.
But you do want to give them the wave.
If you don't, that's like giving them the finger.
Kinda, yeah.
So what, like a two-part question, but both related. What led you to move away from there? And I guess how old were you, and like what was your path to moving away, and then what led you to move back?
um, the away part, my parents were both New Yorkers. My dad was born in the Bronx. My mom was born in Queens, and they came to Wyoming for a job, for my dad's job back in the mid 50s, or late 50s, and then moved to Laramie a couple of years later. And we were sort of raised to leave, you know. And there wasn't at the time a whole lot of economic opportunity here, and I left because I transferred colleges. I went 2 years to the University of Wyoming, and then because I was part of the debate team, transferred to a small college in Western Illinois, which it turns out my wife also went to, although we didn't know each other at the time. And there wasn't a ton of opportunity here, especially for, I became a professional theologian for a while, and then went to law school and became a lawyer. And there would have been opportunity as a lawyer, but I left because I sort of felt like there was probably a wider world. But I always had this always felt like home to me. I mean, actually, New York City does too, but in a completely different way. But this was always kind of home, and my wife liked Wyoming, and we thought, and we started coming here when my mom was still living down in Laramie. Um, and after a while, it was like, yeah, it's this is a pretty nice place. and she expressed a certain love of Wyoming, and I thought, well, that's kind of all I need, because this did always feel like kind of my first home. So it's changed. There are more people now than there used to be, but it's actually not changed a lot culturally in the last 50 some years.
Wow.
So it still sort of feels like, it's always felt like home, and it still does. I always had kind of a desire to come back.
I saw. I think that Wyoming is the least populous state in the country.
Yep.
Even less than Alaska, although Alaska is a lot bigger. And I bring that up, and I was looking at like the population density, and it was, I guess it's the second least densely populated state. It's like 5.9 people per square mile, and the only place lower was Alaska with like 1.6. And I
Yep.
say that more because there's you can look at just numbers and just be like, oh, okay, it's a number, it doesn't mean anything, or it's just a number and that's it. um but I guess for me, the I try to want to put those into like context of like what that means, because I get like the largest numbers that I saw for like population density is like, New York has 429 per square mile, and New Jersey has the highest in the country with like 1,263 people per square mile. And when you say that, it means a whole lot. Like I was looking at like Google Maps, and just like I think I was like near where you are, and just kind of like being on an open road, and you can be a voyeur looking in and be like, oh, like look at that vista, look at that view, imagine it would be great to live here. But there's a difference between being a voyeur or even traveling or reading about it and actually living that every day. Because like to me, the basic thing was like, imagine being on the road and your car breaks down and there might not be a person coming by for hours. But I just kind of wonder if you can like maybe go a little bit more into like what that's like and how that translates into, I don't know, just how you live and how you see things.
Yeah, well, we could talk about that for a whole hour. I'll give you a couple of. I mean, I used to think when I lived in a high rise in New York, and I would look out over like a 3 block area, more people lived there than lived in my hometown. Where I am now, more people lived in my building than live in the community, which is about 50 square miles. So the population density matters a lot. You're right that, in fact, we just did get stuck coming back from the Bighorns, and it was like, yeah, okay, there's cell phone service or there isn't cell phone service, and you know, it's beautiful, but you either need to have skills or you need to be careful because nature is not particularly forgiving, and preferably both. And I don't have skills, so I can just be careful. And so there are dangers here, but it is, in terms of like daily life. There's one thing that kind of holds, I think, New York and Wyoming together, which is something I've always kind of appreciated. You can pretty much do whatever you want in both places. In a place like New York, it's because there are so many people that nobody actually cares. In a place like this, it's because nobody's actually going to know. So you can kind of do whatever you want to do. So there's that kind of I don't want to say I'll say self determination is something that holds them both together in terms of what you can do. Although I think the underlying values are a little bit different. But it's in some ways it's an easier place to live. But in New York, I never had to drive 30 miles to get to the grocery store, and here I do. Uh,
Wow. How
and
fast can you go on the roads?
speed limit is 70, and if you go over 75, you'll get stopped.
Really?
You can go about 70. And I hated to drive, and I hate to drive in urban areas because it's just such a pain in the neck. But out here, it's kind of fun because it's like you just point your car and you go.
Mhm.
And you can there's antelope, there's mountains, there's the changing light makes the same scene that you saw 5 minutes later will be different because the spaces are so open and the light is so different
Mhm.
depending on the time of the day.
Wow. That it makes me want to start a fifth career. Get a camera and move out there and take pictures.
There are a lot of photographers out here.
Yeah.
Most of whom just kind of fell into it, and it's there's no way you can do a bad picture, but there are better and worse, and there are a lot of people who take a lot of shots, and I'm kind of becoming one of
Uh-huh.
them.
So what was it when you're talking about like it always felt like home? What, I guess, what was, is there a particular thing that kind of like tugged at the heartstrings for you?
I think There were a lot of things. I mean, the land is one of them, and it creates, I think, a different attitude toward change just generally. Because if you look out at the land, other than a house here and there, it's going to look pretty much the same 1,000 years from now as it looks now, except that there's mining. The culture of the place. I mean, the politics have changed quite a bit, but the culture of the place has not changed really very much. It's the contrast with an area like New York is in New York. You would get invited places because people thought you were smart or you were interesting or they could get something out of you. There were fewer invitations just because people liked you. Here, nobody cares if you're smart or interesting. They care if they like you. And the value is a little bit different. And I always felt, partly because I grew up here, I always felt a little bit more at home with that.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's interesting.
It's also a broad generalization. I mean, there are obviously exceptions running both ways, but as a general kind of cultural place, the value is this is a nice person. We want to be around her.
Now, did you feel that you've changed at all from your time in New York in returning, or was it pretty easy to kind of settle back in?
It was pretty easy to settle back in. I mean, the biggest thing you had to overcome is that people would find out I was from New York,
Uh-huh.
and that's I mean the misunderstandings that run again both ways between especially rural and urban and small town and urban, and just kind of the suspicion that attaches both ways is at a fairly high level. I was able to overcome it because I could always say, yeah, but I grew up here, and so then it was all right.
Right. Well, I think once when I think about like that, the setting that you're in, and I think about the setting that like I'm in, there's a different relationship with the government, and like we're not necessarily talk politics here, but just if you think about your neighbors and the dependencies and whatever, like when you have a concentration of 8 million people all packed in really closely, the government becomes more important because there's just so much coordination and services and things that I think can be taken care of where you wouldn't be able to do that. I would imagine in like a place like Wyoming where things are so spread out, it would be so ridiculously expensive and really foolish if you have a problem. And I don't know like whether you have firearms at home, but like, if you're going to wait for a police officer for if you have a problem,
Right.
I imagine it could take a long time before they can get to your house. So you're more independent.
Yeah, I mean we're in a county that has about 25,000 people,
Mm-hmm.
which is geographically the size of New Jersey, is the closest state. And there are certain towns, Cody and Powell, that have their own police forces. We aren't really a town; we're unincorporated. So you have a sheriff's department that is covering this entire county, and yeah, you gotta call them if you have an issue. And you're right; it's going to take them a while to show up. I mean, the government thing is really kind of interesting because the attitude toward government, as you might imagine, is somewhat more negative here than it is in New York, which is interesting because the government is actually pretty efficient. In fact, I was just talking with this neighbor I was talking to about the elk. We had we had an issue out here with somebody who wanted to plan a resort out here, and there was a public meeting, and it was great, and the commissioner, the planning and zoning board, from all appearances, were listening to people. They took people seriously. They had a clear path. Something happened at the end. Somebody said, well, we didn't get much notice, and the woman on the staff of the planning and zoning board said, well, here's what the law requires. It requires this kind of notice. That's what we did. But if you would like us to do more, please tell us. And it was like, yeah, okay, I don't get this when I call up New York City government. I just don't.
Mhm.
So the attitude toward government is kind of odd because I think government actually works pretty well out
Responsive.
here. It's very responsive. I mean, you can when we were getting our because we had to drill a well and then we were going to wait a little while before we built. And so there was a permitting issue, and I called up the State Department of Environmental Quality in Cheyenne, and within 2 minutes, I was on with the head of the State Department of Environmental Quality. Now, part of
Hmm.
that is just time and density, and they're not quite as harried, I don't think. But part of it is they actually want to be responsive, and so they are.
I was thinking back to your talking about if you're driving and your car breaks down, or just in general, it's like you were saying you should either need to be smart and careful, or you need to be skilled. And I think like the thing there is it goes back to the idea of like just self-reliance, like for your own survival.
Yep,
It's got to be one of those two things. You can't go to the government, and I think
that's
from
right.
that it kind of like everything else kind of flows from that. It's like you got to be more on your own, and therefore like we're just a little less connected. And it's not, but by survival, that'd be like if you were looking for somebody else to help you, you probably wouldn't survive, I would think, for very long, if you're always thinking like there's somebody else that's going to be there to help me.
That's right. I think that's absolutely right, and it's and I don't have skills because I grew up in a small town,
Mhm.
but it was a town, and so I don't have the kind of skills that people have. I mean, every now and again, I think about oh, wouldn't it be nice to live in the middle of the forest? I'm thinking, no, I can't. There's no way.
Yeah.
The worst that's going to happen where we are is that we get snowed in for a couple of weeks. And but yeah, you the number of skills that people have out here is actually kind of astonishing, and it's a value in a way that um, in the early teens, everybody that I knew, and they were not necessarily people with a ton of they weren't but people with a ton of money because they didn't have an in-house staff to do it. It was, oh, I'm getting TaskRabbit to do this, or I'm getting so and so to do this. If you do that out here, people get suspicious of you. That this is somebody who can't do anything on their own, and so there are certain things I can't do on my own. Most things, but there are certain things I can, so I do, and I help people out. And if it's, I mean, most of what I do is cook a lot, so I give people a lot of food, and that seems to cover that
Mhm.
seems to cover the oh, this person's just a layabout sort of thing. But
Mhm.
the and I want you learn how to do things, and if you're not interested in learning, that creates a certain amount of suspicion. Because you're right. I mean, you can't really call the plumber, right? Because the plumber's 30 miles away. So you got to learn how to do some of this stuff.
Wow. Yeah, I would. I might perish real quickly.
Oh no, you wouldn't, because the plumber is I went to the plumber about a couple of things, and it was like his thing was, okay, I'm going to show you how to do it, and I said, I don't know how to do any of this stuff. And he said, I have confidence. I'm going to show you how to do it. You're going to succeed at this, and I
Mhm.
did. But he was also foregoing a trip with labor, and he was foregoing some money to get me to do it, but he would rather have me do it.
So there's almost like a sense of I like it's interesting because it's a different kind of community vibe. It's like you're all kind of in this together, and it sounds like what you're saying is that for your purpose you might not be able, you don't might not have the skills, but you contribute good meals. So or I
Yeah,
guess, and everybody, you've got to get by on your own or just have something to offer to the community whenever you are like with everybody else.
I think
Um,
that's a really good way of putting it. I don't have anything to add to that. I think that's great.
and I guess because there may only be one plumber, so like if you're good at plumbing, we need you to be part of the community. I don't know if that's it, but I'm just trying to kind of extrapolate from what it's like, and then to take like say like the New York City tone of politics or whatever, I would think then that if you're in Wyoming and you're used to kind of being more self-reliant, more independent, and there's just the government's not going to be as engaged in your life, when people are seeing things about we should do this or we should do that, the government should do this, the government should do that. In New York City, it's helpful because there's 8 million people and they just like, and again, the government's involved with our lives and whatever. But it seems like in Wyoming, maybe the culture is a little bit more kind of like already settled and understood, and these other things that are coming. I mean, I'm just asking or kind of spitballing here, but does it kind of come across either like leave us alone because this stuff doesn't matter, or leave us alone because you don't understand what it's like to live here, or because it does seem that in some respects, like because you have the densely populated areas, they're going to have a bigger megaphone, which could be kind of annoying to people who are like, you're talking a different language, you're talking about a different world than we live in.
It's both of the things that you mentioned. It's and now with the increased with the increased mobility and the availability of the internet, um, people are self-selecting in a way that they didn't used to as much. They always used to, but not as much. And there are people who are coming here for the specific, sort of anti-government. We want to be left alone, um, and there's there is kind of an attitude about that in certain circles, and you're right too that when people are talking about you know I mean, energy policy is the easiest one because this is an economy that is based in large part on energy, um, and the kind of left right, uh, you know drill baby drill on the one side, or don't ever do anything like don't ever explore for energy, is not really something that has, at least in my experience, are not really alternatives that had a lot of truck here, because people need jobs, and energy provides a lot of them. On the other hand, people love this land, and so they don't want to see it. They don't want to see it be decimated, which has happened in certain parts of the state. So it's a little bit more subtle. And you're right that when people are talking about one extreme or the other, it really is like, yeah, you don't really understand what's going on.
Now, what I would like thinking of that nature, and you kind of referred to this, but I want to understand a little bit more. On the one hand, it seems like so beautiful, and if anybody would be worried about the state of the nature and the beauty, it would be people who live there. But then on the other hand, it seems so immense that I could picture also being like, what's like either what's the big deal, or like we have so much of this and this is our natural asset. Like we can't open up a store and make a living to take care of our family. There's not enough foot traffic or car traffic. So what are we going to do other than use the natural resources we have? And if you want to show us another way to do it, go ahead. But to just say don't do this because you're worried about the state of Wyoming because you went there once on vacation and you thought it was beautiful is not really a dialogue.
I think that's right, and I think positions out here are a little bit more subtle than than they appear, not necessarily at the at the congressional level sometimes, but at the individual level there is a people want to keep things the way they are. On the other hand, they recognize that they need to find some way to develop opportunities in the state. And one of the ways that has come through historically is in energy policy.
Mm-hmm. So to change tack a little bit, as I'm thinking about like where you are, like if you order something on Amazon, does it get there next day, or do you have to wait a few more days?
It's usually pretty prompt. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and we order a lot of stuff we order a lot of stuff that way because there are just certain things that you can't get here. We try to show up local when we can, and you pay a little bit more to do that, but
Mm-hmm.
that's just the way it goes. You don't pay a lot more to do it, but you do pay a little bit more. Um, but I mean, we get UPS, we get FedEx, we get all that stuff, and it's you know it's something that the availability of the internet has changed a lot. I mean, we couldn't have done this 20 years ago because we have jobs to do. And my wife is a playwright. I'm a lawyer. And run another business, and we couldn't have done this. But with the internet, we can. So it really does. It frees up uh, quite a bit of mobility. And with the advent of and we do get we get FedEx, we get UPS. I mean, we have in towns we have paved streets there, and cement sidewalks just like everybody else.
Where do you is when you go to town, is there a Walmart? Is there like what is town exactly when you're going to go in?
There is a in Cody. There's a Walmart. We're about 30 miles from Cody, about 20-25 from Powell, and those are towns of about 9,000 and 6,000 respectively, which makes the 9,000 one I think is the 10th biggest, 10th or 11th largest town in the state. So it's but they've got. We also have access to Cody as a Yellowstone National Park access point, so it has a lot more than than other towns of 9,000 might. But you can get the grocery stores are pretty good. You can get what you need to get.
Mhm. And what's the is the food much different? And I think more in terms of like because you have all these wild animals, whether they're elk or whatever, antelope. Is there a lot more game meats to eat? Is there a lot more? Do you have your own little stash of things that you're hunting, or what's eating like?
Well, I don't
Dining.
hunt, but I am happy to take gifts of hunters when if they decide to give them to me. And there are people who, I mean, there are restaurants that will serve bison or occasionally elk, but it's not that frequent. It is still this is still beef country. But a lot of people hunt, and people do it both for the sport of it, and some people do it for the economics of it. That if they get an elk, if they're lucky enough to get a tag for an elk and are able to get one, um, you know they can eat for a couple of years, on that, or at least
Really?
a year on that elk. And so for some people it's really an economic thing. It's a cost saving thing. For other people, it's a sport with an economic benefit, and for other people, we have a friend who when he gets an elk permit, he says, "Yeah, I don't really actually care if I get one. It's just fun to be out there."
Hmm.
So, but there's a lot of hunting. I mean, I think virtually everybody in our community except for us hunts,
Hmm.
and some retirees who've come out don't hunt,
Hmm.
but some of them do too.
And are there wild bison that are open for hunting, or are there?
No,
Yeah.
those are
Okay.
very tightly controlled
Uh,
because of what happened in the 19th century.
mm,
Some there are permits for bison, particularly for native populations.
mhm.
Uh,
Okay.
so they're permitted to hunt under various regulations that I don't really know. But no, I can't go out and hunt a bison. That
Mhm.
that would be illegal.
Okay. Now Wyoming is from it's a Native American word. And how many like what's the population for Wyoming? How much of that are Native Americans, and are they close by, or do they kind of live separate lives from the non-native population?
Well, I mean, most uh, Native Americans nationally are not on reservations anymore. Um, I think it's maybe 30%. I'm not sure I've got that right. There's actually a wonderful book that was done a couple of years ago by an Ojibwe, David Troyer, uh, called "The Heart of Wounded Knee." That is really a contemporary account of native populations. So I really recommend that book. I mean, it's a terrific read. Um, in Wyoming, we have. About 2 hours south of us, we have the Wind River Reservation, which is comprised of Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho. The Northern Arapaho were supposed to be temporary in the 19th century after the Sand Creek Massacre, and as frequently happened, um, the government didn't do what it said it was going to do, and so they're there permanently. North of us, Montana has 6 or 7 reservations. We're just a few miles south of the Montana border, and right on the border, uh, there's the Crow Reservation, and then just east of that, the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. And those are, I've not been to the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. I have been to the Crow Reservation. I was actually just on the Wind River Reservation a couple of weeks ago with a church group, and they are fascinating places. And the people who at least people that I talk to, you know, that's their place. They love that. They love it. And the Wind River Reservation is actually one of my favorite places to go in the state. I mean, it's just beautiful, and but there are only. I mean, the reservation is about the size of Connecticut, and I think maybe there are 10,000 people on it. About a little over half are Northern Arapaho, a little under half are Eastern Shoshone.
Wow. Yellowstone, how far away is that from you?
Well, as the crow flies, but we're not crows,
Mhm.
it's 40, 50 miles. It takes, but you have to go over one set of mountains and then into another set to get to Yellowstone. We are about an hour and a half from either of two entrances, the northeast entrance or the east entrance through Cody. And an hour and a half. I mean, that's like neighbors out here. So it's this is a particularly picturesque part of the state because you're in the Absarokas, or just outside the Absarokas, um, and through our canyon to go back to Native history, or around our canyon was where Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce executed their temporary escape from the cavalry up through Montana before half of them got stuck in northern Montana. So it's an historic area for that. But we're about 2 hours from the Wind Rivers, about 2 hours from the Bighorns. Um, you know, 20, 10, 15 minutes from the Absarokas, and an hour and a half from Yellowstone. So it's in the northwest part of the state, but it's kind of centrally located for all the goodies.
Mhm. I was looking at a Google Maps to see how far away it was from where you were, and one of the things that was interesting is that it kind of had a detour because the roads were closed, and I don't know if that was snow or whatever, but it just seemed to be a really interesting, I guess, situation where it's like there's no alternative routes. Like if this one
Yeah.
route has a road closure, that can change a 1 hour trip or a 1.5 hour trip to like a 5 hour trip.
Yeah, we can't actually get to Yellowstone in the winter because the roads are closed, and it is for snow and snow and ice. So we would have to go instead of an hour and a half. It would take us about 5 hours because we would have to go all the way up through Montana and back. And one of the most beautiful drives is the Beartooth Highway up through southern Montana and northern Wyoming, and that's all closed in the winter, just
Mhm.
because it's going up. I mean, where I am is comparatively low for Wyoming. It's like 4,500 feet above sea level, but I mean, I'm looking out at mountains less than 10 miles away, and those are 11,000 feet. Beartooth Highway goes up around 12,000 feet, so it moves up pretty quickly, and there's just a lot more. There's a lot more snow there, and they just don't really want to plow that in the winter because it also creates some risk.
Yeah. Wow. Um, so I've never been to Yellowstone, and I have to say, we're not necessarily a very outdoorsy family. So this might be a very, very ignorant question to be asking. But like, what makes Yellowstone? I know it's beautiful, but like, what makes it special compared to other parks? Like, what is it what is it that has distinguished that amongst all the national parks, that you've seen, or just from what you know?
Well, it's the first. And the Shoshone National Forest, which is just like 2 miles from us, is also the first national forest. So
Mm-hmm.
it's first. It's I mean, we're actually still in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So It has pretty much every kind of climate you want, except that you could have, except for a tropical rainforest. It is largely thermal, so there are a ton of there are a ton of hot springs which run all the way down through the Yellowstone ecosystem, and makes the water here sometimes a little sulfury. Uh, or we call it thermal, or I call it thermal. Um, it's home to elk, uh, deer. Now it's home to bison. Although this was not the primary, it's where the bison have really been relocated to. It has it's very high mountains. The 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 water that runs through it runs in these kind of gigantic falls, and the canyons are cut very very deep. Um, it's now that's true of a lot of. I mean, it's certainly true of the Grand Canyon, and all the parks running down through, John Wesley Powell's journey. So it's just. I mean, all national parks are beautiful, but it's just beautiful, and it's different. I mean, probably the thermal aspect of it is what makes it is something that not a lot of other parks have.
Are there like spas? I mean, like, how touristy is it? Is it all pretty controlled? Are there like spas for people to go to enjoy those thermal springs? Or
There are a couple of hotels. It's run by I don't, is it the National Park Service? I can't remember who runs it, but it's Department of Interior in one way or another. There are a few hotels. There are some and then outside of Yellowstone, there are a couple of resorts, particularly up in Montana, and obviously down in Grand Teton National Park, which runs just south. There's Jackson, which is kind of it's a town that basically is a resort, for the hyper wealthy. But it's very it's very well run, and if you can get there in the spring or the fall. I was there in the fall, and there was basically nobody else in the park. So there was a red fox that came up, sniffed the car, and I could just stop the car for a while because there was nobody behind me. If you come in the summer, it's a little bit crowded, but it's still we had a friend out from New York a few years ago who had never been to Yellowstone, and one of the things we went a couple of times with him, and one of his remarks was, I have never seen Americans look so happy as here, because it's just this. There's not a bad spot in it. It's all beautiful. People, people are pretty relaxed when they're there, and it's just gorgeous. I think especially in the spring and fall, if you can get there before the crowds get there.
wow. And this is not a paid endorsement from the Wyoming Tourism Board either, by the way. Just putting
Well,
that
and in
out
fact, Yellowstone is since COVID, a lot of the national parks have gone to like timed entry.
there. Hmm.
Yellowstone hasn't done that yet, but I think they're thinking about it because it can get pretty crowded. Um, but from all I can see, it's very well managed.
Hmm. So what has it been like to be a lawyer in Wyoming versus what you were doing here in New York?
Well, because of what I do, which is mergers and acquisitions, it's been the same. Because in a way, in New York, most of my clients were not New York based. Uh, my clients here are not Wyoming based. The general practice of law, I think, is a lot different. In New York, it is hyper specialized, as you know. Here, the same guy who I've known for 40 years did our real estate deal as he's doing our estate planning. Because here people, I mean, it really is kind of a state full of country lawyers. Everybody does a little bit of everything because there's not enough business to specialize to the extent that you can do in New York, which in some ways makes them, I think, better lawyers because they're more flexible. They know more stuff. They have to know more stuff. And if they're diligent and dedicated, they're pretty smart at what they do.
Huh. Like more. I guess like I would think like it goes back to the and I don't know, but it would seem like that idea of you saying more of like the practicality for just to kind of live there. I would imagine that would also then translate to being a lawyer. Like you have to be practical. You have to be reasonable in what you're doing.
It really does. I mean,
Hmm.
I'll tell you a story about our real estate deal. Um, we got from the selling realtor, and yeah, I mean, you've seen. Yeah, you didn't do real estate, neither did I, but you've seen New York real estate contracts. They're immense.
Yeah.
Um, I got a thing that was like 3.5 pages. It was okay. So I called my lawyer and I said, I got this thing. I don't know what to do with it. And he said, let me tell you what not to do. He said, I know what your temptation is. Your temptation is going to be basically rewrite it and mark it up. He said, I can do that for you. It'll cost you a fair amount of money because I'm not cheap. Um, and what's more, you're going to lose your land if you do that because people just aren't going to put up with it. So here's what I'm going to advise. I'm going to advise that you pick out one or two things that are really important to you. So this is the standard real estate contract. It works. The courts, have their view of it. It works pretty well. Pick out one or two things. Just say that. You'll pay me a lot less money and you'll get your land. Best legal advice I ever got.
that don't I guess if you're going to pick your battle, you have to pick your battles, and you want to not ruffle feathers unnecessarily because yeah, as you know, like if the proper junior associate that would get that contract would just kind of tear it apart, include 7 riders and 3 additional documents, and turn that 3 pages into 300 pages.
Yeah, and we all we really wanted is we wanted to make sure we had water. So that
Right.
was basically all we added was a contingency for water, and I think we added like one other thing, and it's fine. I mean, people say, yeah, that makes sense, but it's you know even in what we used to do in the M&A market. I mean, most the deals that collapsed got collapsed. Not at least my impression was always they didn't collapse for economic reasons so much as they collapsed because people got sick of each other. And it's just that here people can get sick of each other a little more quickly because it's just like, why are we doing this? I mean, the same lawyer was telling me about you know, a deal down in Pinedale on the west end of the Wind Rivers. And, like the buyer wanted a survey and the seller said, you're nuts. Of course, this is off by 100 feet or 200 feet. And if you're buying, this much acreage, who cares? And I'm not paying for it. And so went and found another buyer who didn't insist on that. So yeah, it's a much more practical. How do we get this done in a way that makes everybody reasonably happy?
When I got into wine sales, one of the things that is very off-putting is like you have these financial transactions, and there's nothing other than not even a handshake. It's just send me this
Yeah,
and we'll pay you back. But what I always found is like I actually really like that way of doing business, because if we have to refer back to a contract to get my way or whatever, then it becomes not a relationship, but just kind
right.
of like it becomes something more coldly and impersonal. Now, I mean, obviously, you have contracts to also govern people's expectations and to structure things to make sure, like, big complex transactions and whatever, happen the way they're planned for. But I think it kind of removes the human element a bit. And I actually really like the fact that, what, like if somebody doesn't pay their bills, I don't want to work with them. In fact, I don't want to work with people who aren't able to pay their bills. And sometimes things happen, but in general, I don't want to rely on a contract. I want to rely on a handshake or just like
Yeah,
a look in the eye. And it sounds like that's kind of more the way the legal, I guess, like not really the legal climate, but more like the people climate, the community climate is more, yeah, we do want to rely on a handshake.
yeah, and
Is that right?
it also is a different. I mean, I mentioned this before. It's a different priority of values. Um, when when you ask about someone here, the first thing out of people's mouths is straight shooter, honest man, whatever. Now look, there are, I'm sure, per capita as many crooks out here as there are anywhere else, but the value is you do what you say you were going to do. And we had to dig a well here because it's because we had to find water. I never had a written contract with the guy who did it, and it if he hadn't found water, I could have stiffed him. There's nothing he could have. I mean, I guess he could have sued me. I mean, I wouldn't have, but I could have. And my wife and I actually talked about this, and she said, yeah, but if you do that, he's like one of the two people who do this, and it gets around. I said, yeah, but what if we weren't interested in another piece of property? Um, I think his view of it was, it's just not worth the trouble. And I believe this guy is going to pay me, and so he'll probably pay me. And if he doesn't, I'm going to sleep just fine at night. And if he sleeps just fine at night, more's the pity. So it really was, and it actually came in like underbid. I mean, I have no idea what he could have charged me anything he wanted. Because what do I know about drilling wells? But he didn't. He charged me what he said he would, actually less than he said he was going to charge me because he found water more easily than he thought he would. And it was just two straightforward people dealing with each other. He thought he was going to get paid. I knew he was going to get paid. I thought he wasn't going to overcharge me. He knew he wasn't going to overcharge me.
It seems like there's a lot of unwritten, not necessarily there's a lot of unwritten rules, but it seems like what the ethos that governs survival and living in Wyoming is more about those unwritten things, which it seems like it's, again, to go back to try to understand like New York to Wyoming, is that if there is a communal expectation of behavior and interaction and relationships and working together. And it would seem to me that if there are things coming in that are trying to disrupt that you really kind of tearing at the I guess the heart of like how you survive there. Is that an accurate way to kind of
I think
describe my
I think it
impression?
is. I think that most of I mean, every place has their code, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think what makes the cultural code. I mean, I love New York, but the cultural code I never really signed on to. You know, Politically, I'm much closer to the average New Yorker than I am the average Wyomingite. But culturally, this is kind of a code I understand, and I understand it partly because I grew up here and it hasn't changed very much. But and you're right, it is. I don't know that it's more unwritten than it is anywhere else because I think there are plenty of unwritten codes everywhere. It's just a question of whether you kind of understand them or not.
Mm-hmm.
And this code, I think I understand pretty well.
Yeah. And for the New York purposes, like I think there's codes and there's way of getting by, but the community is a lot like if that the codes that we're talking about might be how I interact with my neighbors in my building. But once you get outside your building, the circle becomes bigger, and you don't know how they are. You don't know how they think about things. So you can just see it as different. I don't, and I think maybe that's the point of some of this podcast is to. I guess there are certainly universal truths or values, but there's a lot more kind of gray area, and there's just a lot more of like, this is just the way you do things because that's what the environment dictates. And what happens in Wyoming is different than what happens in New York.
Yeah, and it's it's a priority to earnestness, being fairly straightforward, and there's I think a sense of honor that to go back to a really old value that is that's respected. You do things. This is the you do things in a certain way. You do them in a straightforward way. And if you become known as a person who does not do them in that way, I mean, there was apparently a builder out here who was basically driven out of town because nobody believed what he was saying anymore. And I mean, he built the house of a fellow I knew, and was vastly overcharged and didn't do what he said he was going to do, and that bunch eventually left town or left the community. Um, so I think it is a different, it's a different set of priorities that operate here.
Hmm.
And you kind of have to if you're down with that code, it works fine. If you're not, it probably doesn't.
So, since you have really been immersed in the two vastly different worlds, um, what do you think? Would you say, like, do you think is the biggest misunderstanding of Wyoming, and then what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding of New York?
It, it's a really good question, because I think that when I lived in New York, uh, particularly uh, with people I dated, it kind of became clear that until I met my wife, who was not this way. Uh, it was like, oh, there was this kind of undertone of, you must be, one of the few sophisticated people in Wyoming, or from Wyoming. Of course, that's why you're not there anymore. And I think, what probably made those relationships not work is that they found out there was a lot more yokel in me than they had originally thought. But it's, I think the misunderstanding is really twofold. There's, on the one hand, a romanticization of people who live out here. And on the other hand, there's kind of a contempt for their intelligence and their sophistication. And, I guess my answer to that is, you think you're so smart, you try running a ranch at a profit, and we'll see how well you do. Um, on the other side, I think that people out here think of urban areas as uh, some combination of uh, scary, and again, not everybody, and I don't want to, but the kind of general, it's scary, it's mean, people don't care about other people, that kind of, they're overly sophisticated, so they don't have any respect for us, for us yokels, which is, you know, at certain points true, but at certain points not. So I think there is sort of a casual contempt that runs both ways. Um, that's unfortunate, because I mean, I gotta say, I was happy in both places, and I think there are. I mean, this is a great country with a lot of different ways of living, all of which work, and all of which, or many of which work. Some of them don't, but many of them work, and they work, depending on who you are. And you can have a certain amount of respect for how other people are living once you understand how they're doing it.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's true, and it is such a vast country. I think people, Americans, like we think of like United States, and they compare U.S. to France, or Holland, or like whatever, and you forget like those are countries are small compared to our country. Like, we're huge in population, and we're vast in terms of like the size and the distances between places. And I've used these analogies before, but like we just you can't relate. Like, there are like there are countries where there are very different cultures between neighboring countries. Yet when New York looks at Wyoming, or Wyoming looks at New York, they're both kind of, like you said, kind of a little bit casually contemptuous of how they live. But it's like, it's two remarkably different areas, and how could they be the same? Of course,
Yeah,
they're going to be
and
different.
and one of the things I appreciate about this about what you're trying to do is, you got to try to understand them before you make your judgment. and it's, um, I think that's harder with the advent of, of uh, media that has basically, whether it's social media or network media, that has decided there is a ton of money in, and rightly, that there is a ton of money in making everybody angry. So it's so you get caricatures of what people must be like that are both romantic and contemptuous at the same time. Before you actually try to talk to them and say, how are you doing this? What
Yeah.
is it? How is it that you live your life out here? And what you're doing, how does that change what you do?
Yeah. Well, the thing I guess what I think about is like, even like the I think even the idea of like judging at all, like it seems like the judgments are made based on the extreme examples that are like in some of like news is supposed to be the anomalies. That's why it's newsworthy, but we're now being kind of like almost forced to say no, this isn't the anomaly. This is the true thing. Like when you
Yeah,
see a crime in the city, it's not an anomaly. That's the
right.
way the city is. There's crime all over the place, and it's dangerous, and it's falling apart, and
Yep.
the cops are like, backs are pinned against the wall. And on the other hand, you see some extreme thing in the rural part of America, and it's like, oh, they're all like that. Watch out, you can't trust them. And the idea of judging first, I think I'm trying to really deliberately not even like pay attention to that, but I could go to my neighbor's apartment and I could judge 1,000 different things that I think they should be doing differently in their own home. So I
Yeah.
just think like I think we've been kind of we're being encouraged to have judgment, whereas I think like we need to fight that and kind of more be willing to kind of say like, I don't know enough to judge. And if you
Yeah.
do want to judge, go throw yourself into it and really learn. But if you don't want to do the legwork to actually understand it, then you probably shouldn't judge. Do you have an opinion? Sure. Do you want to talk about it? Sure. But this is stoking the animosity and the division and like really kind of promoting ignorance because you don't know enough is the bad thing. And again, I think we should be striving to learn more, and that means talking and listening more than just judging.
Yeah, and I think it. By the way, I want to go back to something. There's a you mentioned uh, the places in America are more different. You mentioned it elsewhere too. Are more different than certain, say, American cities and non-American cities. There's a in the old movie Dog Day Afternoon with Al Pacino and John Cazale. Um, they're trying to escape from they're trying to get out of the hostage situation, get out of the bank, and Al Pacino says to his uh, sidekick John Cazale, "What foreign country do you want to go to?" And John Cazale says, "Wyoming." Uh, that's a great movie with a great line. But it's it's. I think if I had a recommendation, it would be to talk in a sort of what you're doing. Talk to as many different people as you can, and talk to your neighbors. I mean, we have a friend here who when COVID hit, this suddenly became a hot area, as did every other area. And she was saying, well, people want to come here because it's safe and all of that. And I said, I got to tell you, I never felt safer than when I was in New York City because you're never alone. So walking at least in Manhattan, if you're walking, I never felt. Now I'm not a woman, so that's gave me a little bit more confidence maybe, but uh, I have never felt safer than in New York City. For the reason that I was never alone, which is also one of the things that drove me a little crazy about New York City. I could never be alone. But in terms of crime rate, it's one of the safest places in the country. And we had, long before we got here, there were a couple of killings out here in the late, I guess, the late aughts. And what I'll tell people is, with this population, that means that New York City's murder rate would have to continue for like 20 years before it would catch up to just this. So, and but I think the way you kind of change people's minds, and it's not all at once, is by having those kinds of conversations. Say, look, I lived there, and it's not that, it's something else. And so, maybe she's not as free with saying that again.
Yeah. Well, you paint a very captivating and encouraging, and I guess a picture that makes me more curious than anything. So, well, we may show up on your doorstep sometime.
And you should, because we got plenty of room, and there are places to go.
That would be great. So, Kyle, I should let you get going, but before I, wrap my interviews up, I'd like to ask people, like what gives you hope at the end of the day?
um, I think it was just what we were just talking about, that I have a friend who recently passed away, who was a friend, since high school. He was in
I'm
Cheyenne,
sorry.
I was in Laramie, and he was, just a dear, dear friend. We agreed about almost nothing, politically, but we talked a lot. And there were certain things that I moved him a little bit on. There were certain things that he moved me a little bit on. I was just talking to his wife a couple of days ago, and she said, "Do you have any interest in horse racing?" And we talked about a lot of stuff. And I said, "Well, I can't remember whether he recommended it to me or whether I recommended it to him. But there's a book called Secretariat by William Nast, which I think is one of the best it's the best sports book I've ever read." But we talked a lot. We talked specifically. We disagreed a lot, but the core values were the same. It was, being decent, being respectful, and those things come through in local, specific conversations. They don't come through in the national media. So I think what gives me hope is that we can still have those conversations. We can have those conversations with people with whom we may not completely agree. Uh, but in order to do that, and this is the other side of it, we have to kind of turn off a lot of what social media and other media are trying to tell us, and we have to do the kind of thing that you're doing in this, which is get out of our bubbles and explicitly look for people who are very different from us to have those kinds of conversations with, and to have those kind of friendships with, and to do them over a long period of time. It can't just be an occasional thing. It's got to be, you've got to do it with a certain, I don't want to say frequency, but you have to do it with a certain amount of regularity, because otherwise we're not going to understand that people with whom we have sharp disagreements have a lot of the same value sources and ethical sources and religious sources that we do. And if we can have those kinds of conversations and keep them going over a long period of time, it's just it's a different tone. It doesn't mean that we're gonna agree, but it means that we're not going to want to kill each other.
Yeah, yeah, it's all very valid points. Yeah, and I think we'll get there. I do think that what social media has done is it's a revolutionary human invention, and I think we all have to learn how to reframe the world in a way that I think more accurately reflects the reality. And we have to understand that social media is a distortion, just like the news media was a distortion, and it always has
And if
been.
you got a simple way to do that, tell me.
Well, I like to think. I think when you go back to the olden days, think about back back for like, in the 70s, or like when I was growing up, or even like the 80s, like you got your news, either maybe you listened in the morning for a little bit, or you listened in your car ride, and then you worked all day, and then maybe you came home and looked at the paper for 20 minutes, and that was your
Yep.
exposure to the news. These days the news wants you watching it 24/7. CNN is on everywhere, or Fox News is on everywhere, and you're made to feel anxious about things, because that keeps you coming back, and it makes you insecure, and they get you dependent on it. And then after that, you feel powerless. So not only are you anxious, but you feel even
Yep.
more anxious because there's nothing you can do about it. And I think it's a vicious, slippery slope that the more conversations I have, the more I think people are becoming aware of it. And I think we're all better off if we just kind of turn it off and go back to really almost like a principle of what you see in Wyoming, which is just like a handshake. Like, get to know the people that you're living with.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it's, again, I mean, the media has found a way to make a lot of money by keeping us angry. And it's the same story again and again and again. And it makes you miss what's going on right around you. So I'm much more local about how I look at things. It doesn't mean I don't have views on national issues, but in some ways they just don't, they matter, but they don't matter for what I'm doing this afternoon. What matters for what I'm doing this afternoon is, talking to this guy, that I was talking to, before we got on. And that's not, it's not, it's not political in kind of the larger national divisive sense. It may be political. I mean, he was talking about, somebody, driving across BLM land to get to do something south of him that wasn't, that he didn't think was quite what they should be doing. So, I mean, in that sense, it was political, but it mattered, right? I mean, it's what can people do with the land right here?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I suspect we could probably talk for another hour or so, but
We should
we
do it
should wrap
again.
this up.
This has been great.
Part two. Well, Kyle, thank you. This has been spectacular. I'm so glad we could have this conversation, and thank you for agreeing to do it on the podcast.
Oh, really, my pleasure, Michael. It's I think what you're doing is really, really is really an important project, and I wish you all the success, because I think it will help not only you, not only me, but everybody else too.
Thank you very much. Hope so. All right. Take care.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye.